So this runway in Suriname might look ordinary, but in 1980 it became ground zero for a secret Cold War crisis that would reshape American covert operations for decades to come. Now I know because I was there. Well, technically not during the crisis itself, but 5 years later as a 10-year-old, our backyard literally shared a fence with the dictator's compound. His name was Desi Bouterza, and the neighbors called him Desi or Bauta. I used to have a playhouse in my backyard where I would climb up on the roof, and I had a spy telescope, and I would peer over his backyard, and there was a black panther that would pace back and forth. And they'd have shards of glass that would be embedded at the top of the brick fence. And on the other sides of the shards of fence were these dictators, not these dictators, they were these teenagers that had Uzi submachine guns, which I thought was pretty cool because I'd only seen those before in Miami Vice. Meanwhile, this isn't just my story, though. This is how a tiny South American nation, it was a former Dutch colony that was rich in bauxite, which is the ore that they used to make aluminum, which was really important, especially during World War II, because it seems like everything was made out of aluminum back then. But this country became the testing ground for what would later be called Project Democracy, which is Ronald Reagan's blueprint for changing out regimes, overthrowing countries that he thought were a communist threat. So let's back up a little bit. February 25th, 1980, just 5 years after independence, Suriname was in major chaos. There were 16 non-commissioned officers led by Bouterza, who was then just kind of a chicken farmer, former basketball star, and had just returned to South America after independence to help kind of drain the swamp of Suriname. And he launched what became known as the Sergeant's Coup. But when they seized power and took the capital, there was two specialized American aircraft that were sitting on the tarmac at Xander J. I always mix that up. I think it's Xander. Man. Anyways, they changed the name. I think it's Johan Pengel Airport now. Anyways, my Dutch got really bad after I left Suriname. But the crews, there were 26 American crew members that were stuck at their hotel while Bouterza's troops threatened to shoot if the planes were moved. Now, these weren't ordinary planes. They were EC-135Ns, Arias. They had these 7-foot antenna dishes housed in these, they look like an alcoholic's nose. They call them a drop Snoot nose cones, which were designed to track space missions and gather intelligence. They would cost about a $4.5 million back then, about $16 million today. But they weren't the famous Doomsday Planes. If you've ever watched those movies where they get the president on the plane because of a nuclear attack, and that's called the Doomsday Plane. This wasn't exactly that plane, but it was like a cousin to that plane. Those planes were designed to keep the president alive during nuclear war. These planes were critical components in America's nuclear command infrastructure. So, according to Deputy Chief, I wrote it down so I wouldn't get this wrong, but I'm still going to butcher it, Noel Pazdral, the standoff was resolved through his direct negotiations with Bouterza, who personally ensured the safety of the crew that was traveling out to the airport. Bouterza had actually received training with NATO back in the Netherlands, and so he understands it's not a good idea to pick a fight with America the first day of your job as dictator of the new country. Well, bigger fish to fry. But the damage was done. They had exposed a massive blind spot in U.S. national security, and specifically 3 critical weaknesses in American security planning. So first, you had an intelligence vacuum. So Suriname had been considered pretty stable for the U.S., that they really didn't even bother having much of an embassy down there. They didn't even have a CIA station chief at the time. So overnight, a strategic hub had fallen to a couple of sergeants where nobody really understood their ideologies. A lot of people believed differently. What did Bouterza believe? He had this leftist contingency in there. What do they stand for? Are they going to continue the treaties? All these questions were unanswered, and they didn't have good answers because they didn't have intelligence. Secondly, they had a more terrifying question to deal with, which was, what happens if a nuclear crisis erupts and you actually had a president or their successors needing to land a plane, and they had landed in a country like a Suriname, and now they can't get out? because 16 NCOs had taken over the country. That's a bigger problem. Finally, they had another flaw, which is like America had this thing called a federal arc, which was like a ring of hardened command centers. So think bunkers built during the Eisenhower era that were all now vulnerable to Soviet targeting. Part of what they were using these airplanes for was to recover satellite footage that was in the Azores, where they had this wide awake field where they used to eject satellite canisters and then they would retrieve them, and then they need to have a place to land. But the timing just couldn't have been worse, right? So a couple weeks later, March 14th, 1980, America's warning system detected what appeared to be Soviet missiles that were targeting North America. Now, it proved to be a false alarm, but it came so soon after the Suriname incident that it triggered a national security overhaul. And this is where President Carter at the time got directly involved, and they responded with unprecedented speed. So within 4 months, the president personally authorized a radical new approach to dealing with nuclear survival. So Operation TREETOP came first. This was abandoned the old, like, let's have a fixed bunker somewhere model, and instead it created this mobile teams that would accompany the president's successors to these random, unprepared locations, creating uncertainty that would actually protect them against Soviets being able to target them, make them easy to find, right? So in May of 1980, Carter ordered Exercise 9 Lives. Now, this was the first comprehensive test of dispersing presidential successors, including like helicopter evacuations and communication systems between multiple hidden command locations. And by June, Carter had signed Presidential Directive 58. So this fundamentally reimagined how government would function during a nuclear war. So beforehand, they had thought of it more of like a single catastrophic event that would occur. But now they were thinking of it more as potentially like prolonged conflict that would require sustained leadership in case one got knocked out, who was going to take over for the president, and so on. So this wasn't just a procedural change. It was National Security Advisor at the time, another name that I can butcher here, Zbigniew Brzezinski, later described it as a major revision of our strategic doctrine. It was a shift away from rigid war planning to a more flexible, enduring approach. So when Reagan took office in 1981, his team inherited this framework and then they completely transformed it. So by December 1981, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, some of you who are historians of the Iran-Contra Affair might remember that name, he had been tapped to lead an interagency working group on the continuity of government. So all these bunkers and everything that we've been talking about. So what began as defensive planning in the Carter administration, ensuring that leadership would survive the crisis, became a blueprint for covert ops. So the same communications networks, the autonomous funding, the chain of command protocols designed for nuclear survival could also enable like deniable intervention into foreign governments. So within 10 months, Reagan signed 3 national security decision directives that weaponized that continuity of government protocol. NSDD 47, July 1982, was on emergency mobilization, followed by NSDD 55 in September on enduring national leadership, and most critically for our story, NSDD 61 in October, which is still classified to this day. It was officially about protecting command aircrafts, like the ones on the tarmac that we talked about, but they had a hidden purpose that we're only really now just starting to understand. Reagan also transformed the entire classification system. So his Executive Order 12356 reversed the standard for declassifying documents, and he eliminated timelines for automatically releasing documents, which is why some things like NSDD 61 are still classified. And he allowed information to be reclassified even after it had been released for public consumption. So the result of which is what I call the secret model, SCRT. I've got a diagram in here for you to see. which created the ideal conditions for a shadow presidency, where major decisions could be made off the books and executed without public scrutiny or any congressional oversight. Meanwhile, Suriname started kind of tilting leftward. Bouterse was never an ideologue or an idealist in any particular camp. He was not ever a pure Marxist or a socialist, or he really was a chameleon. They called him a wakaman in Suriname, somebody who was raised on the streets, who was more interested in power and looking out for himself, and kind of he was really good at reading the rooms and kind of seeing the weaknesses and playing different groups of people for his strategic benefit and to keep himself in power. But at this time, he had a couple different dances with Cuba and Nicaragua. There was a lot of revolutionary fervor that was going on at the time, because a lot of countries were gaining their independence and they were looking at different models for how they were going to run things. So you had countries that historically had been colonial superpowers that had ran them, with foreign businesses and foreign interest in their countries. And as soon as the people got back control, well, the first thing that they voted for democratically was to benefit themselves. They were like, okay, we're going to take our land, our resources, our mineral rights, everything that we have, and we're going to use it for infrastructure and healthcare and build houses and literacy programs. This is what happened. There was a big movement in Grenada where a guy named Maurice Bishop took over, and he was doing that with his New Jewel movement. And this Maurice Bishop was a huge inspiration for Bouterse, right? He wanted to kind of model Suriname a little bit after what Grenada was doing. So this whole process was happening, and the Americans viewed this leftward drift as a big risk, because Ronald Reagan he's a former actor, right? He was a cowboy. He wore the white hat in the movies. He saw the world through black and white lenses. There's black hats and white hats, and there's no room for you to have flirtation with Marxist ideas, or you're a communist if you're looking at anything in that world, and according to his mind. And so he saw the Suriname having diplomatic relations with Cuba and Nicaragua and other places as a sign that they were losing them to the Soviet Union, and pretty soon it would be a missile base that could attack America right from that northeast shoulder of Suriname, South America. So this faction within Bouterse's military council aligned with Cuba. That guy that we talked about earlier, Badrisan Sital was his name, and he had met with Fidel Castro in Managua to celebrate the kind of the national liberation of Nicaragua at the time. And that didn't sit well. And so a pivotal moment came in May of 1981 when Bouterse issued a formal socialist manifesto. So according to Dutch intelligence agent Peter van Haperen, who we'll get to later, he's a very controversial figure in this story. But he said, and this has been confirmed by other sources, that Bouterse had his advisor made a secretive trip to visit with Fidel in Cuba. So by June, Havana had established an official mission in Paramaribo. Now this alarmed Washington to no end. So by September of 1981, Dewey Claridge, who is the chief of the CIA's Latin American division, and he becomes a Iran-Contra figure himself, he debriefed the director of Central Intelligence on Suriname. So by early 1982, coup planning was underway. The formal Suriname-Cuba diplomatic agreement had happened a couple months earlier in November 1981, and that cemented the U.S. fears. And then when Bouterse forced out President Chinna Sen, which is a name you're going to want to remember because he's going to come up here over and over again in the next few years or next few episodes. When he forced him out in February of 1982, allegedly over his disagreement with the Cuba thing, preparations accelerated. So the blueprint became NSDD-17. It was signed in January 14th of 1982, and it authorized military training for, quote, indigenous units and leaders, and, quote, public information operations and contingency plans against all Cuban forces and under the banner of supporting democratic movements. And in English, they're funding local mercenaries and resistance movements. They are doing psyops and other types of disinformation and propaganda against the local population to get them to turn against the people that the West and America didn't want in power, in this case Bouterse. And they were supporting democratic movements, which is like resistance movements that had the name like, Democracy for Suriname. We'll talk about the specifics about that in a little bit, but you get the idea. So by October of 1982, when Reagan signed NSD 61, the one that's still classified, all signs point that they were going to intervene in Suriname. They had apparently acquired weapons through NATO depots that they had broken into and stole weapons from. Coup training was allegedly being provided not only through Peter Van Happeren, who we talked about being controversial, but he said he was trained by a guy named Bob Denard. Look him up. That dude has got a crazy story. Took over his own island before being ousted and then retaking it back. So they were planning this thing that I've started to call Operation Red Christmas in December of 1981. And I call it that because they planned a similar thing in Christmas of 1981. Sorry, they were planning it in Suriname in December of 1982, but they had planned something similar in Nicaragua the previous year, December of 1981. They actually, you can read the declassified documents. I've written about this in the archives back on Substack. They went in and they were running terror operations on the Mosquito Coast, where the Mosquito Indian people were living at the time, to try to kind of rally their support. So they were doing exactly the blueprint of what they washed, rinsed, and repeated here in Suriname the following year in 1982. But the problem is that Bouterse caught wind of it. They caught wind of it. Some people, allegedly, according to Van Happeren, were worried about the potential of loss. 800 to 1,200 people were potentially going to get killed in this coup. And he said that they leaked the plans to Bouterse. Now, that was only one of the ways that they leaked it. We'll cover more of that in another chapter. But Bouterse executed 15 prominent citizens. We're talking, he kidnapped them in the middle of the night, took them from their beds, dragged them from their children, and brought them down to Fort Zeelandia, which is a moated, stone brick fortress down on the banks of the Suriname River, right on the coast near the ocean there. And he executed them at this little place called the Bermuda Triangle, claiming that they were part of a USA-backed plot. Now, whether Bouterse acted on legitimate intelligence or he used the specter of foreign intervention as a pretext for eliminating his opposition, we don't know. We know what it looks like. The December murders either way became a national trauma. It's like their JFK assassination. And it was a pivotal moment in U.S. Cold War operations. Now, near the end of his presidency, Reagan declared that during his 8 years, not 1 inch had fallen to the communists. And he mentioned success stories like Grenada, which, by the way, the blueprint for the invasion of Grenada came out of the blueprint for the invasion of Suriname. And I've also discussed this back in the archives. You can look up the sources on that. So, but Reagan remained very quiet. In fact, he remained silent on Suriname. And there was a reason he had to keep that a secret. And that's because his covert operations in 1982, leading up to the December murders, had helped lead to the deaths of 15 prominent Surinamese citizens. And what was worse, Reagan had been protecting their killer through a proxy of Brazil, which we'll talk to about in the coming episodes as well. So these Suriname incidents don't just represent like a historical footnote. They're really an inflection point in the Cold War where defensive continuity planning, dealing with a potential nuclear attack, evolve into offensive covert operations, going on the attack, on the offensive against anybody the Reagan administration deemed to be communist, and that they didn't want to have to get permission from Congress to be able to get rid of them. They could use this as cover. They could classify the materials. They could raise their own money through drug deals and missile trades and other things. that would allow them to self-fund their operations without oversight and go in and bring the jackals and overthrow regimes. And they did this over and over again. So what began as a stranded aircraft on a tropical runway ended as this template for shadow warfare, repeatedly deployed over and over again during the Reagan administration. And in Paramaribo, Project Democracy found both its kind of testing grounds, if you will, and its tragic first casualty. The blueprint that was drafted in those early days would soon be implemented with devastating consequences. So for me, as a child living next door to Baltazar, I couldn't have known any of this stuff, right? But decades later, after piecing together declassified documents and testimony from people that were there, and the connections between my childhood backyard and America's covert operations have become disturbingly clear. So in next chapter or week, we're going to cover the wolves of Suriname, specifically how Reagan's Project Democracy stocked the pond in the American embassy in Paramaribo with people who were designed to destabilize Suriname using recruitment of Baltazar's right-hand man, using labor unions, using the press to put pressure on him, and then simultaneously to set the stage for what would be an invasion on Christmas Day in 1982. So tune in next time. More on that story to come. Thanks again for checking out my video. If you like this kind of content, go ahead and like the video and subscribe. That way you'll get notified when the next one drops. I also invite you to join my Substack. I put a link down in the description, but there I go ahead and share all my backstory. I've been working for years, but writing for the last year on episodes regarding the history of Project Democracy in Suriname. So I like to share citations. I'm putting together timelines that will be available for everybody. And you can read through the old catalogs and the collections there and also get alerts if you prefer to read about these things rather than watch the video. Either way, thanks again for stopping by. Like, subscribe, join the Substack. Look forward to seeing you there. And thanks again.